So I'm going to tell you a little bit about work that has been, I guess, propagating in my research group over the last 10 years. And there are too many people to mention in terms of my team, past and present, that have done this. But just to flag, this is a really collaborative piece of work. And if you're interested in what we do, feel free to follow me on Twitter, and you'll find my web resources there. So we kind of look at soil and we don't think very much of it, do we? It's dirt. It's that brown stuff beneath our feet when we're walking around. But if we reflect on it and think about it a little bit more deeply, we in fact owe our entire existence on this planet to this 6-inch layer of topsoil and the simple fact that it rains. So I think the fact that we ignore our soils is a real problem, and it's led to propagating those problems in terms of our agricultural ecosystems. But in fact, soils are remarkable things. They are teeming with life, from tiny microbes that you can't see through to much larger animals like the mole in this rather twee picture from an EU project that I was involved in. But this teeming diversity of life is what makes soil soil. And indeed, it's how soils are made, and it's why soils function in terms of providing the ecosystem services that we rely on, things like producing food, for example. I'm not quite sure what's happened to that slide, but never mind. The organisms that live in soil are often living in really intimate symbiosis with other organisms, and one of the most striking examples of this are the plants, particularly the plants that we eat as crops. And microbes interact with our crop plants in lots of different ways. They can interact in a symbiotic way that is parasitic. So they damage those host plants, and they can interact with the hosts in a way that is mutualistic. And as Anton de Bary, the famous German scholar, said, defined this as the intimate living together of unlike organisms. And in a mutualistic context, this is to their mutual benefit. And there are many groups of organisms that live in symbiosis, but two of the most important that live in symbiosis with plants and indeed with each other are the fungi and bacteria. Fungal symbioses are absolutely ubiquitous in nature. Indeed, about 90 to 95% of all plants that live and have ever lived form mutualistic symbioses called mycorrhiza. And we have an almost equally abundant suite of symbioses with bacteria, and these are prevalent across lots of different plants, but many of us will recognize the intimate symbiosis formed between plants and bacteria in the form of legumes. So legumes have this symbiosis with bacteria, that the bacteria are able to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and provide that nitrogen as a nutrient to plants. So we have this complex web of interactions where carbon that is fixed through photosynthesis in the shoots of a plant is transferred into the roots of plants, and it's then used to feed these microbial communities. And represented in blue are the fungi, and you can see little bacteria swimming around as well. And this energy in the form of carbon enters the fungi, allows them to capture nutrients from the wider environment, to take those up and to transfer them back to the plant effectively as fertilizer. But that energy also feeds bacteria that not only live inside the roots, but live in the wider soil, that are equally responsible for dissolving and breaking down organic matter and releasing nutrients that then flow into our plants. But this incredibly coordinated ecosystem of organisms working together, these ecosystems are often very highly structured, and very highly conserved. So we have different groups of organisms that particularly favour associating with different plants. They don't structure spontaneously. You can imagine that that would be a very difficult thing to do. They rely on conversations, as we would if we were organising a night down the pub. They rely on the flow of information. And we really, as corny as it sounds, might consider the soil to be the original and first information superhighway. Now, I've broken this down into very simple terms. So we've got our red blob as our host plant, a fungus, and a rhizobia, which is a beneficial bacteria. And we've come to understand, and Sheffield has been at the forefront of leading some of this work, we've come to understand the need for signals, the need for a fungal symbiont to shout out to its host and say, hey, I'm here. And it does this through a suite of compounds that we now come to call mic factors. And the host in itself also needs to tell the fungus, this is where I am, you need to come and find me. And it can do this through a suite of smallish molecules that it puts out into the soil called strigolactones. And these chemicals that enter the soil are really the language of the soil. And it's only recently that we've been able to decode and understand what these signals mean and what the consequences of disrupting those signals might be. Bacteria do something very similar. The host will shout out that it's present, and the bacteria will send a suite of signals to tell the host to get ready for this symbiosis to start to occur. And this makes sense. You know, if you're a plant, you're sat in an environment that's trying to kill you, you have very little opportunity to run away from those stressors. So you have to defend yourself. And these signals are critical, not just so the partners can find each other, but so the partners recognize each other as friends rather than foe, and don't use their relative immune systems to destroy or kill each other. So as you can see, this is a really complex web of interactions, and different types of these classes of chemicals are produced by different organisms. So we have this huge mass of chemical information encoded in the soils that need to be deciphered by the organisms that live there. And there is a way that we can start to understand that. We can tease these ecosystems apart experimentally. And one of the ways we can do this is we can tag the bacteria in the soil in such a way that we can see them. So in this case, we made them glow. And we can see how their abundances and their relationship with their host plant change when other microorganisms are present. So in this figure, it's a very simple experiment that we did. We genetically modified bacteria so they would glow. They expressed the green fluorescent protein, so they would glow under the right wavelength of light. And what we could do is extract bacteria from the surfaces of plant roots, and we could ask the question whether or not the presence of mycorrhizal fungi changed the structure of those communities. So did we see more microbes, beneficial microbes, when we had our beneficial fungus present? So this graph simply shows you in the control and the AMF bar. AMF refers to the mycorrhizal fungus. These are just spontaneous bacteria that made their way into this ecosystem. And the next bar, PGPR, that's where we provided a glowing beneficial fungus into the beneficial bacterium into the ecosystem. And when we simultaneously provided that ecosystem with a mycorrhizal fungus, we saw that double the amount of bacteria could be recovered from the host plant roots. So that's because the mycorrhizal fungus not only produces energy that feeds those bacterial communities, but it changes the nature of the signals and the communication that happens within the soil around the roots. And one of the ways that we can tease this apart is to use molecular biology and molecular genetics. what that means is we can start to change the stories, the signals, the language that is being spoken by plants by preventing them using genetic methods from making certain signals. So this is a slightly complicated diagram, but all this represents is all of the complex chemistry of signals that are being produced by the root of the plant are represented in these two axes. So the closer one dot is to another, the more similar the chemical cocktail that they produce actually is. And this was done in maize plants that have two different types of root. They have crown roots and they have primary roots. And as you can see, these different coloured dots represent different mutants that we created, where we turned off particular parts of the language, the chemical language that this plant was able to speak. And in green, this is what we call the wild type. So this is the plant that we haven't messed with. And the blue, the purple, and the red all produce signals that are very different from the original wild type plant. So we can effectively change that communication. And what's really exciting is when you then have a look at the bacteria that colonize those roots, you can see that the communities are completely different when we have altered the language, I guess, that plant is able to speak. So here we have our three different mutants, BX1, 2, and 6. And this Venn diagram shows what happens in the roots for bacteria and for different fungal species that occur in the soil. So the outer circles show you totally unique species of bacteria and fungi that are present, and then the overlapping ones show you shared species that are shared between two or more of the mutants. So as you can see in the middle, for example, we've got 650 bacterial species that are common to all of our plants. But when we look at our individual mutants, we can generate communities that have up to over 500 totally new species there, just by changing the nature of the chemical language that the plant is able to speak. So why am I telling you all of this? It probably sounds a bit esoteric that some geeky microbiologist is messing around with the languages that plants can speak. But there is a real important background to this, and that is because agriculture essentially does the same. For years, we have used agricultural processes like fertilizers, tillage, pesticides, and reduced uses of fallow periods and lay meadows. And essentially, what this does is denude the agricultural soils of the beneficial microbes on which our plants depend. And sadly, we have bred our plants in this environment, and we bred our plants where the soil is incredibly poor. And this is just a simple piece of work that a master's student did with me and a colleague, where he took soil from underneath a woodland and then in a straight line through a hedge, the grass margin of a field, and then 2 and 32 meters into an agricultural field. And he grew wheat in that soil. And what he was able to show is by the time you're 32 meters into an agricultural field, the soil has become like concrete. It's basically lost all of its biological diversity. And as a result, we see a 70% reduction in the growth of our plants. And remember, this is where we grow our plants, and they're performing 70% more poorly in terms of their growth than if we were growing them in soil we'd taken from a woodland. And that's quite shocking. So the damage that we've done to our soil means that we've bred our plants essentially without access to these beneficial microbes. And as a result, they've essentially forgotten how to speak that language, how to communicate with the beneficial microbes on which they would have depended in the natural environment. And that's a problem, So for a long time, we were able to keep doing this, keep growing our crops, because our crops were dependent, addicted, if you will, to a chemical cocktail of fertilizers. But sometime during the 1990s, we started to notice that our ability to produce more food, in this case cereals, from our soils in the UK, year on year on year, started to break down. And in fact, that trend started to flatline. And the most recent data suggests that the yields of cereals, at least in the UK, are in decline. And I really think, and I'm not alone in this view, that this breakdown in soil function as a result of agriculture is now limiting our ability to produce food. And that's really important. So we've damaged our soil, we've denuded our soil of these beneficial microbes, and we've bred our crops in an environment where they haven't had access to beneficial microbes, so they've forgotten how to communicate with them. They've lost the genes that encode those signals. So how do we fix it? We need to breed new crops, and I think we need to embrace all technologies available to us. As controversial as this sounds, ethical and consensual GM is necessarily part of our future. If we are to wean ourselves off fertilizers that cause huge environmental damage, we won't be able to make agriculture net zero, for example, easily without embracing at least some next generation genetic technologies. We need to protect our soil, and we also critically need to raise awareness. As scientists, we need to tell this story so people can understand, governments can understand, and we can work with policymakers to help shift policy to support our farmers and our agricultural growers to be more sustainable and ensure that a regulatory framework is in place that allows them to achieve those goals. So we need to put our heads above the parapet. I was fortunate enough to be asked to attend the Paris climate negotiations in 2015, where I spoke about the perilous state of our soils and the need for coordinated government policy to protect our soils, because we've lost about a third of our arable land just in my lifetime over the last 40 years or so, which I think is absolutely terrifying. But it's obviously a bit scary as a scientist to put your head above the parapet and say things that are potentially unpopular. A certain right-wing news organization in the States, whose name shall not be mentioned, followed up this story where they described me as a peddler of university disaster pornography. So we certainly do get a backlash as scientists from telling the truth about the perilous state of our food system. And because of that, the University of Sheffield responded to the climate crisis and the impending food security crisis, a taste of which we've seen when Brexit emptied our shelves earlier towards the start of last year. We've responded to that threat and created the Institute for Sustainable Food, where we're designing tangible solutions to these environmental problems. And Mary is one of the stars of our show, and she's going to tell you about her work in a minute.
Thank you so much, Duncan, for your incredibly inspirational presentation. And in the words of some of the alumni, thank you very much for talking about this in very easy to understand language. It's been highly inspirational as any time I hear you speak. But for now, let's move on to the star of this webinar. Mary, if I can hand you the floor.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, Duncan, for the amazing presentation, and welcome everyone to the talk today. And before starting, I would like Luke to share my presentation on screen. Can you do that, Luke? Thank you so much. Welcome to the talk again, and I'm Mary. I'm from the Department of Animal and Plant Sciences. And today I'm going to talk about, can we tackle global warming, acid rain, and smog all at once? So for starters, I'm from New Delhi, and New Delhi is really famous for a lot of things, one of them being street food, old monuments, and botanical gardens as well. But however, many of you might be knowing that another thing which New Delhi is famous for is air pollution and smog, especially in the winters. And having been lived in New Delhi for the last 11 years, I didn't pretty recognize such environmental pollution and the air pollution that we face in Delhi is such a huge problem until some years back when I had to go to visit a doctor due to some respiratory issues. And the doctor said that you'll have to use a nebulizer in order to breathe and in order to take medicaments for breathing. So at that moment in time, I realized, oh God, this is such a huge issue. And so many people across the world are living in such circumstances. So one of the major reasons that we see the smog and air pollution in Delhi is because of burning of residues by farmers upscale in the north of India. And because of meteorological and weather conditions, what we ultimately end up, especially in New Delhi, is the smog and air pollution. So after going through the medical experience, I also realized that I started thinking about ways in which these farmers can basically use the crop residues, as well as thinking that why don't they do it at all? I mean, they are farmers, they can use the crop residues for mulching, as manure, as compost, instead of just burning it up. So later on, I also had the experience to explore this question when I went to one of the states of India, that is Rajasthan, and as a part of my master thesis, and got to talk to some of the small-scale landholder farmers over there. So I visited one of the farmers' house, and when I entered this house, it was actually during the lunchtime. And these people, they were just sitting there and eating bread without any condiment or without any side dish, any curry, which we usually enjoy in urban areas or in the Western world. And at that moment in time, I realized these people, it's so ironic that these people are the ones who are producing food for us, and they are supporting the economy, especially agriculture plays a very important and huge role in the economy of India. But they are the ones who themselves cannot even afford one balanced diet per day in basically. And this is something which struck with me. And later on, when talking to one of the stakeholders who was involved in the distribution of seeds, which are distributed to poor farmers in order for them to sow and harvest, he told me that one of the reasons is that sometimes the fertile seeds that we distribute from the government get mixed up with sterile seeds. And these are, of course, seeds which come from Monsanto sometimes and from other huge multinational companies. However, these sterile seeds, they do not produce any fertile seeds in the next season, and thus the farmers, they have to buy the seeds in all the seasons if they are using the sterile ones. And another thing is that these seeds, they require, as Duncan mentioned, they require a lot of nitrogen fertilizers and pesticides to yield higher grain yields. And that means that these farmers, especially the small scale holders, they of course get caught up in this vicious cycle of debt because they don't have a lot of resources to grow crops and utilize them or utilize on-farm inputs in that sense, because the crop residue, it's not going to yield so much of nitrogen or so much of, it's not going to support the crop yield from the sterile seeds. So at this point, I realized that this is what I want to work in basically, and later on I got an opportunity to do the PhD, which I'm working on right now, and I'll be talking about it in the second part of this presentation. So I also want to have your attention towards some other problems that we are facing in the 21st century. It's not just air pollution, it's not just smog, but we also have issues such as eutrophication. Now, eutrophication means that there's an extensive or there's an excessive amount of nutrients which are present in the water bodies, and this leads to the growth of algae. Now, these algae, when they grow, they are of course going to utilize as being living organisms, they utilize the oxygen which is present in the water, and therefore kill off other living organisms. According to the report from Environmental Agency, which came out last year, 58% of the surface water bodies which are there in England have already exceeded the nutrient threshold limit, below which they are basically nicely functioning. So that is one thing that I wanted to put some focus on. And another thing is acid rain. Now, in the later 19th century, I remember that England and the UK was struggling with acid rain because it was causing a lot of corrosion, damage to property, corrosion to the statues, corrosion to metal infrastructure, and many other issues as well. And third problem that we are facing now is, of course, the global threat of global warming. So as we all know that carbon dioxide is one of the greenhouse gas which is widely known to capture heat and work as a greenhouse gas, therefore leading to the global rise in temperatures. However, there is another gas, that is nitrogen dioxide, which is 276 times more potent, and which means that it's going to cause much more damage and much more rise in temperature as compared to a molecule of CO2. Similarly, nitrogen dioxide is also known to deplete ozone, which basically leads to more and more harmful sun rays getting into the environment. And last but not the least is we are losing our biodiversity. As Duncan has already touched upon it, I also wanted to add another point that the rise or the enrichment of nutrients in the soil, it also leads to increase in the growth of only certain kind of species or animals which are dependent on these nutrients, while the other organisms which are very sensitive to the presence of a high level of nutrients are displaced and even go extinct. So this is a really worrying situation for us, because our biodiversity is the one which is making our entire ecosystem, our entire planet function. And if it's lost, basically we are also going to go extinct. So apart from these problems, there are other problems as well, which directly affect our health. So some of them being, so the health effects that we see are basically respiratory illnesses and cardiovascular diseases, which come from air pollution and smog directly. And then we have issues such as skin cancers, which are linked to a higher rate of UVA and UVB rays, which are entering into our atmosphere due to the depletion of ozone layer. And of course, we also have blue baby syndrome, which is basically the depletion of oxygen in the blood of newborn babies due to higher nitrate concentration being present in their blood. And then there are other chronic diseases such as hyperthyroidism, kidney stones, and of course, the environmental issues that we are seeing are directly causing these health effects. So what is the common link between the environmental issues that we see and the health effects that we are experiencing right now? So if we look at some reports, one of the common link is higher nutrient fertilizer use, especially nitrogen. And it's not just devastating our environment, our air, our soil, our water, but it's also causing a lot of issues to our health as well. So it's really important for us to switch to sustainable practices which reduce the amount of excessive nitrogen, but at the same time also supports the soil microbiome, right? So one of the ways to do that is, first of all, I would, of course, like to tell you that why is nitrogen important at all? So nitrogen, it's a major component of amino acids and proteins, which basically, as if you have studied science, you might know that they are really important for the functioning of our body. And of course, it's also an important part of the DNA, which is the molecule of life. And in terms of plants, it's a major component of chlorophyll. Now, chlorophyll is the green substance which you see in plants. And it is really essential because it is responsible for photosynthesis, that is converting carbon dioxide into oxygen, which we breathe, and glucose, which is the food that we get from these plants. So, however, excessive use of nitrogen is disrupting everything. And in order to ensure that we still keep on supplying nitrogen to our plants so that we get good yields, as well as ensuring that our soil microbiome remains functioning, we have to urgently and right now switch to practices which are sustainable. So one of the solutions, or what we are working on, is rhizobia. So rhizobia are nitrogen-fixing bacteria which are found in the soil and in the roots of legume plants. So legume plants are plants such as which produce pods, beans, and peanuts. And in terms of cover crops, we have vetch and clover. So these plants are really important because they produce protein-rich food for us, as well as are also known to produce help support the soil functioning because of nitrogen fixing. So before diving into that, I would talk a bit about the rhizobia. So rhizobia are the ones which are responsible for the increasing the nitrogen content when we use cover crops. So rhizobia form symbiotic association with legume plants, and they form small nodules in which they fix nitrogen, which is present in the atmosphere. Now, many of you might be knowing that 78% of nitrogen, so our atmosphere has 78% of nitrogen. And you might be wondering that why don't the plants directly use them? This is because they cannot use the form which is available in the atmosphere. So it needs to be converted into a form which can be used by them. And these bacteria essentially are doing that job for them, for the legume plants. And in turn, the legume plants are providing carbon for metabolic activities and in general, the functioning of the bacteria. However, the rhizobia that we see that I've just described are widely varying in terms of how much nitrogen they fix. So some of them, for instance, here I have divided them into X and Y. So X population is the one which is effective. That means if these are the good bacteria, they are going to fix nitrogen very nicely and effectively, while there is another population which is ineffective, which means that these bacteria are also present there in the soil environment. However, they are not really good at fixing nitrogen, or they don't fix any nitrogen at all, but in turn only use the carbon which the plant is providing. So they are sort of like freeloaders, which are utilizing all the things from the plant, but not anyway giving anything in return. So some of the researchers and some companies are already have extracted these effective bacteria from the soil and have scaled them up so that they can be used as a substitute for nitrogen fertilizer. However, it comes with a lot of challenges for these effective bacteria to function effectively. So one of the challenges being that because they have been extracted from an environment and of course scaled up, and when they are introduced into the soils, they have to compete with the native but ineffective populations. That is, they have to fight off in order to form nodules in the plants. And because the Y population is native and hence is better adapted than the X population to the soil, it increases and displaces off the X population. Later on, of course, forming root nodules, which are not really effective at fixing nitrogen. So at this point, or what my project is what I'm working on is rhizobia and virus interaction. So we are focusing on using beneficial viruses to increase this competitiveness. So how we are going to do that, I'll just show you now. So there are some bacteria which are known to integrate in, there are some viruses which are known to integrate in bacterial populations. And whenever the bacteria divides, it's known to multiply along with it. However, these viruses also leak out at constant rate. That means that sometimes out of the whole population, one of the individual cell will be lysed or killed so that the viruses come out and infect any susceptible or newer population to infect them and kill them off. So this whole process is the one which we are focusing on. And how we are going to use that in increasing the competitiveness of effective population is something like this. Because the viruses are going to leak out at a certain constant rate, that means that these viruses are going to infect the Y but ineffective population, and hence giving a higher advantage for the effective population to increase and form nodules, which are very effective at fixing nitrogen. So this is how we are using the viruses to explore a possible solution which might be useful in a higher increase or higher uptake of the rhizobial inoculants by farmers as a substitute for nitrogen fertilizers. However, in this project, what I'm also focusing on is the practices which farmers and urban growers, especially the legume farmers and urban growers, use to enhance the soil microbiome. This is because, like I said, like from my experiences, there are many things which the farmers and urban growers are already practicing, but which haven't been included into research, but which might be utilized for increasing or enhancing the functioning of the soil microbiome. For instance, I recently talked to a farmer who told me that she uses nettles as a concoction to apply to her crops and trees so that they could yield or they could have their nitrogen dose and in turn give higher yields. And practices such as these, I think, are really important and would be really breaking through the enhancement of rhizobial inoculants and the functioning of the soil microbiome. And as farmers are the end users of this technology of rhizobial inoculants, I think it's really important to also focus on what sort of questions or research questions they think about, and if those questions can be used to yield a soil microbiome technology, which in turn would lead to a greater yield without degrading the environment. So apart from this project, there are some other things which I think you can do at the individual level to decrease the excessive use of nitrogen. So for instance, organic crops, organic produce that we get in the markets is something which doesn't use any nitrogen, or depends on excessive use of nitrogen, but depends on traditional forms of compost or manure to produce the crops. and fruits. So it's really important for us to realize that. I know that it's many of you might be wondering that organic produce that we get is something which is really expensive. But I think it also depends on the kind of demand and supply that we have. So if, of course, more and more people are going to utilize organic foods and are going to consume these kind of fruits, it means it's also going to lead to a higher demand for it, which will in turn create an opportunity for farmers as well as motivate them to not use excessive nitrogen. And another thing that we can do, many of you might be having gardens and allotments. So we can, of course, on an individual level also try to not use a lot of nitrogen fertilizers, but instead use manure and compost to grow our crops and produce whatever we do on the allotments. For instance, my mom, I was talking to her recently, and she told me that nowadays, after I told her how bad excessive nitrogen fertilizers are, she usually makes her own concoctions nowadays. For instance, she uses chickpeas to make compost for her plants, which she applies, and she thinks that it is really, really helpful for her plants' growth as compared to nitrogen fertilizers, which she was using previously. So I think there are many other practices as well, which we can do at an individual level, especially if you're a gardener, if you own a garden. For instance, Elin Ingham is one of the persons or scientists who also talks a lot about these practices in various books. And you can follow her on LinkedIn about such practices. And yeah, that's something which we should strive to do. So thank you for listening and coming to the talk. And I would like to thank my supervisors, Dr. Ellie and Dr. Anna, for supporting me and giving me an opportunity for this project. And of course, I would also like to thank Charlotte and Laura, who have been always supportive throughout this organization and presenting of the presentation. And of course, other team members as well who are moderating as well as organizing this talk. And if you have any questions, you can pop them into the chat, and here are the contact details if I miss out any questions and if you want to personally ask me anything. So yeah, thank you again.
Thank you, Mary. Luke, if you could please, yes, brilliant. Thank you. Take presentation down is what I wanted to say. Mary, thank you so much for your talk. Let's jump straight to some of the questions, given we haven't got a lot of time left. But I have a question from Eleanor, Mary, and she's asking, currently standard produce is cheap because of the intensive farming techniques used. Do you think that over time, as we make the necessary transition to adapting regenerative agriculture and permaculture principles, that food will be affordable?
Yeah, like I mentioned it in the presentation as well, that of course, organic produce that we have nowadays is a bit expensive, but I'm pretty sure that the regenerative practices, along with some other technological solutions such as hydroponics, aquaponics. Hydroponics means basically you use, it's a system where you use minimum amount of water, but just a nutrient solution, which you can use to grow plants at home. And there are different such kind of solutions which you can utilize, which people are working on, which I think will support the produce, and in turn it will become more and more affordable for people.
Fantastic, thank you very much. The second question is from Ama, and she's asking, are the needs of developed and developing countries different in the attainment of food sustainability? And will your research do a comparative analysis of these two types of countries?
Yes, of course, I think the needs are different for the developed and the developing countries. As I said, back home, my parents, they usually used to have local produce or whatever we had at home as food was from the local market. While after coming to the UK, I actually, one of the points or one of the major things I realized is that a lot of food that you have in our supermarkets or we have in our supermarkets is coming from import. And there are many other factors as well which determine the needs of the developing and the developed countries. So I think in terms of achieving that, of course, there will be a difference in attaining those things. And apart from that, I'm not going to do any comparative analysis, unfortunately, in this project per se. But yeah, maybe in the future if I'm keen on doing something like this.
Thank you, Mary. And then Darren, he's asking, how and where do you see technology being part of the solution?
I think technology is a really big part of the solution because with the growing population and with the soils degrading at such a huge rate, we need technologies such as, like I mentioned previously as well, hydroponics and aquaponics to support agriculture. And it's where I think it's both at the source and the sink, because what I'm talking about is the source, but at the sink as well. For instance, there has to be technologies which ensure that there is equal distribution, maybe using some app, or there is some other technology which I don't know about.
Great, thank you very much. Mary, I'm just moving on to some of the questions in the chat, so everyone bear with me because I do also need to scroll back and forward. But Simon is asking, how does organic farming fit in, and does soil stay healthy with that regime?
Yes, it certainly does fit in, because I think a lot of practices in organic farming are not just to, let's say, improve or support the food market, or let's say ensure that a good produce is there, which is not affected by nutrients, nitrogen fertilizer use, but these practices also ensure that the soil microbiome keeps on functioning. And I've talked to some of the organic farmers, and that's one of the major mottos that they always tell you, that we want our soils to be functioning as best as possible. And it's not just in terms of yield, but also the microorganisms which are living in there.
Thank you. Dan is asking, he says, thanks so much for an interesting talk, Mary. Do you think a move toward hydroponic farming could aid the reduction of nitrogen fertilizers?
I think, yeah, to some extent it would, but of course I think it has to be not just hydroponics, it has to be a mix and match of different kinds of technologies. What I think is nitrogen fertilizer use is not bad until and unless you go into that excessive mode. So it has to be below a certain threshold. So yeah, that's what I think.
Thank you. We're at 1 o'clock now, but Duncan, I have one more question for you if your connection is stable enough. And Gareth is asking, does the Institute consider the role of livestock in the food system?
Yeah, absolutely. I think integrated agriculture is absolutely what we need to do, and Mary's touched upon that. So, you know, we've talked a lot about organic cereal agriculture without integrating livestock won't feed the world. To investigate everything, so we are looking at things like livestock and how they integrate with the agricultural system, about hydroponics, aquaponics, and our work even reaches out with our partners in Australia into aquaculture. So I think if you're going to solve a problem like food insecurity, you need to view it through a broad lens, and that means looking at all solutions and how those solutions fit together to solve a complex problem.
Thank you so much, Duncan. I think it's time for us to wrap up. Thank you, Duncan and Mary, for taking the time to present to us and our alumni around the world. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, for all your enthusiasm and your questions. I'm really sorry that we weren't able to answer all of your questions. We'll make sure, though, that we will send your questions to Duncan and Mary and see if we can get some answers to you. Yeah, thank you very much for joining, and that's it.